Hi everyone. Let's look at the game Carlsen versus Topalov, played in Nanjing in 2010. So Carlsen had the white pieces, and the players played a Ruy Lopez. Okay, a6, Morphy's defense, bishop a4, knight f6, and now the main line continues castles, but Carlsen played d3. At the time this was played, a lot of grandmasters were playing an early d3 in the Ruy Lopez. The idea is to build up your position before eventually expanding in the center with c3 and d4. The move d3 cuts out a lot of theory. For example, if you castle, you have to be ready for the open Ruy Lopez with knight takes e4, and now black cannot play that. So it's a very positional maneuvering type of game when you play an early d3. Okay, now d3 does support the e4 pawn, so white is threatening to win the e5 pawn after bishop takes c6. So black plays b5 to stop that. Bishop b3, bishop b7, castles, and now d6. Now when black plays d6 in the Ruy Lopez, he's supporting his e5 pawn, and he's releasing his knight. So the knight is now threatening to come to a5 and pick up this nice Spanish bishop on b3. So white should make room, an escape square for that bishop. And Carlsen does that by playing a4. Now c3 is a fine move as well to gain a square here. But a4 makes a little more sense because it has a dual purpose. Not only are you getting an escape square for the bishop, but you're also attacking the black pawns here. So it's making a threat. A takes b5 is a threat since the rook in the corner is undefended. Also, if it's possible, white would like to keep the bishop on this more active diagonal, point it towards f7, rather than maneuvering it to the more passive c2 square. So rook b8 gets the rook out of the way and defends b5. A takes b5, a takes b5, and white has control of the a file. Knight bd2, so this knight is starting on its usual journey in the Ruy Lopez to get over to the king side. From the king side, it can support the center, and it can help in a king side attack. Topalov castles. Rook e1 supports the e4 pawn. It also puts pressure on e5 indirectly. For example, in some lines, it stops black from pushing his d pawn to d5, because after e takes d5, the pawn on e5 would be insufficiently defended. Okay, bishop d7 is a bit of a passive move. Topalov probably should have challenged the strong Spanish bishop with the move bishop to e6. But he played bishop to d7, and then Carlsen played c3 with the intent of eventually playing d4. Okay, Topalov goes back to the a file with his rook. Carlsen exchanges rooks and then plays d4. Now, h6 is played in order to keep the white knight off of g5. Sometimes this f7 square is weak in the Ruy Lopez. Black wants to move his rook to e8 to support his center, but he has to watch out for the combined attack of a knight and a bishop on that f7 square. So before moving the rook over, he plays h6. Carlsen plays knight f1. That's the usual maneuver with this knight in the Ruy Lopez, getting it either to g3 or e3. Rook e8, and Carlsen chooses knight g3. Let's have a look at knight to e3. One problem with that is it breaks contact between the rook and the e4 pawn. You have to consider the consequence of black playing knight takes e4. Well, after knight takes e4, white does have the very strong knight to d5, and he's attacking the c7 point, which would fork the queen and rook, and he's simultaneously attacking the e4 knight. So it doesn't look like knight takes e4 would work. However, black would have e takes d4, followed by c takes d4, knight takes e4 now. Now if knight to d5, black could play bishop to d8 to support both threats. The knight on e4 is protected by the rook, and now the c7 point is protected. So you have to consider a lot of things when deciding whether to maneuver your knight to e3 or g3 in the Ruy Lopez. From either square, it might be headed to the f5 square anyway, but on e3 it does have the extra possibility of going to d5. So Carlsen chooses knight g3. Queen c8 lends further support to this important f5 square, so it keeps white from playing knight to f5 in that position. So Carlsen plays knight to h4, and Topalov sees that both of these knights are pointed at the f5 square, and he believes a knight is coming there. But Carlsen actually has another idea up his sleeve with this move knight to h4 that I believe Topalov just missed. Okay, Topalov plays bishop to f8. So he's letting the rook support his center in case a knight comes to f5. But Carlsen plays the excellent move knight to g6. The pawn on f7 is pinned by his bishop on b3. And so Carlsen is trying to get rid of that dark squared bishop. Very often in the Ruy Lopez, black plays g6 and fianchettos that bishop here after it initially goes to e7 and then back again. And that bishop on g7 is a good defender for the black king. So Carlsen decides instead of putting a knight on f5 to play knight to g6 to eliminate that defender of the black king. Okay, then knight a5 was played to attack the bishop on b3, but Carlsen takes off that dark squared bishop. Now notice black cannot respond with knight takes the bishop on b3 because he'll lose a piece after this sequence. Knight takes d7, knight takes c1, and then knight takes f6 is with check. So g takes f6, and then queen takes c1, and white is up a piece. So after knight takes f8, black played rook takes f8. Okay, and now Carlsen preserves his Spanish bishop with bishop to c2. You may wonder why he didn't play it to a2 to keep it on this nice diagonal. Well, he has plans on c2 to put his queen on d3 and have the two form a battery towards the king position. It's also lending support to his central pawn, and he believes that these central pawns are not going to be stuck there forever, and he's going to get that e4 pawn out of the way of his bishop. Okay, so rook to e8 is a natural move to support the center. And now Carlsen makes an excellent breaking move, f4. He needs to open lines for his pieces. Bishop to g4 was tried, but not such a good move because Carlsen wanted to put his queen on d3 anyway, and so black is just driving his queen to where it wants to go. And on d3, it is attacking that b5 pawn, and also white is creating this battery with the bishop and queen against the h7 point, which can become significant later. Okay, so black would like to maintain his pawn on e5 if possible, but white just simply has too many threats. One of them is simply queen takes b5. Let's say black tries knight to d7 to support his e5 point. Well, there's a tactical problem with that. F takes e5, d takes e5, h3, and the only square for the bishop is back to e6, but then d5 traps the bishop. Okay, so that's why that knight to d7 move is not possible. Let's say instead black tries c6 to protect b5 here and just maintain his pawn on e5. Well, white could play f takes e5, d takes e5, h3. The bishop can go back to either e6 or d7. Let's take a look at each. If it goes back to e6, white can play d takes e5, and then maybe knight d7 to try to recover the pawn on e5. But then simply knight to f5, and white's pieces are starting to overwhelm the black position. Now, if that black bishop retreats to d7 instead, white could try d takes e5, rook takes e5, bishop f4 driving the rook back, and then e5 opening up lines. And then black is again in trouble. That knight is supporting that h7 square, and there's a battery on that square. Okay, so there seems to be no good way to hold a pawn on e5. So because of that, Topalov just gives it up and plays e takes f4, and then bishop takes f4, and knight c4 attacks the b2 pawn. It also protects the b5 pawn. It blocks the queen's access to it. Carlsen plays very patiently. He plays bishop to c1, and that defends the b2 pawn. His bishop is still keeping an eye on h6. He might have a bishop takes h6 sacrifice later on, and white is threatening to push his pawn to b3, drive that knight away, and take that b5 pawn. Topalov tries to complicate matters with a very interesting move, c5. And the point of that is, if white does decide to kick the knight back with b3, black would play knight b6, and then if white takes that b5 pawn, then black would have c takes d4, okay, giving up the knight. If white takes it, then black plays queen takes c3, forking the bishop on c2 and the rook. And it's actually white that's trying to hang on in that position. So c5 is a sneaky attempt to stop the plan of b3 followed by queen takes b5. So a very tactical resource. So again, Carlsen just plays very patiently, puts his rook to f1. So the threat here is bishop takes h6, followed by rook takes the knight on f6. And white would probably preface that with the move b3 first to stop knight takes b2 as a response to bishop takes h6, because the knight would be hitting the queen on d3. Okay, so black tries c takes d4 here, white plays c takes d4, and queen to d8 to support that knight on f6. Okay, h3 drives the bishop back, but more importantly gets an escape square for the white king. White's position is overwhelming, and he's playing very patiently. He's trying to strike at the best possible moment. Okay, bishop e6, b3 drives the knight back finally. The knight doesn't want to go back. If he plays knight to b6 here, then white would have e5 attacking that knight, and that knight is defending the h7 point. D takes e5, rook takes f6 would be devastating. Either way black recaptures, he's going to be mated. For example, queen takes f6 allows queen check, and then the king moves over, and then bishop to a3 is going to lead to a mate with a queen to h8 coming. Okay, so the knight cannot really fall back, so instead Topalov tries queen to a5. And his idea is, well, if white takes the knight with the pawn, then at least he has bishop takes c4 skewering the rook here on f1. And black would play on, probably in a losing position, but he would have some hope. Okay, so now Carlsen plays the excellent move king to h2. So king to h2 is preparing his plan. He would like to play rook takes f6, followed by g takes f6, followed by knight to h5. And then there would be a lot of threats. One of them would be knight takes f6, forking the king and the rook. Another threat would be queen coming over to g3 with check, and white's position would be winning. But after after the rook takes on f6, white has to watch out for this queen to e1 check. So that's why he gets his king off of the back rank to avoid that queen to e1 check. Okay, so Topalov sees this sacrifice coming with rook takes f6, so he removes his knight to h7. But then Carlsen simply plays e5 and opens up this battery that he had prepared 10 moves ago. g6 to block that, d5 to attack the bishop and drive it back. His position is losing at this point, and Topalov tries knight takes e5, attacking Carlsen's queen. But Carlsen plays an excellent finishing move here. D takes e6, sacrificing his queen, and Topalov resigned. Let's see what would have happened if Topalov had taken the queen. Carlsen would have played e takes f7 check. And then the king is forced over to f8 to keep an eye on the e8 square where white can queen. But then bishop takes h6 check, forces the king out to e7. Then the rook is taken with check, king takes queen, bishop takes d3. And already white has a material advantage for his queen sacrifice, but he's also threatening bishop takes g6 check, forking the king and the knight. And the knight is trapped on the rim over there, and white is going to win even more material. So that's why Topalov resigned. All right, an excellent game I wanted to take a look at because it had that early move d3 in the Ruy Lopez, avoiding a lot of theory. All right, thanks for watching.